So a few more people than I expected, but that's OK. We'll roll with this. So if you haven't already done this, head to the GitHub repo up there, github.com/jesse-spevack/clean RSpec, fork and clone the repo. And if you can, complete the welcome survey so I kind of have an idea of who's in here and what you're looking for in this presentation. And then if you want to get bonus points, you can also grab a copy of a bingo board that's located in that Getting Started section. And the idea here is like a workshop this size is actually kind of difficult. And the real tricky thing is understanding the level of the participant, right? So maybe I'm going to pitch this way too high or way too low. Hopefully it's just right. But what I want to do is just give everyone lots of different options in this context. So if you're like an RSpec wizard, grab that bingo board and maybe this will be more entertaining for you. Also, I know this is kind of like a prime spot. There's a lot of awesome talks happening right now. So if you need to get up and go to a different talk at some point, I will take it very personally. I have a camera set up, and actually, if you could just like tweet or something, tweet at me like, hey, had a great time at your talk, but going to a better one or something like that. That'd be helpful. OK, I'm going to switch slides. So if you don't have the repo, make sure that the person sitting next to you has it so you can get it from them. OK, so I'll introduce myself. My name is Jesse Spevack. I use he, him pronouns. I am located in Denver, Colorado. These are my twin 5-year-olds, Eddie and Audrey. So Colorado's awesome. Raise your hand if you are local to Colorado. Woo! Yeah, a lot of Coloradans here. That's awesome. So I currently work at a company called Stripe, and we work on the economic infrastructure of the internet. I wish I could tell you more about Stripe, but this is day 2 of my 3rd week at Stripe. So maybe in a few months you can ask me about it. But pretty stoked about this. Before Stripe, I kind of came to, actually before Stripe, I worked at a company called Ibotta. Are there any Ibotta people here? OK, cool. One up front. I see you. Before Ibotta, I came into coding and the tech world through a non-traditional background. So I went to a program called Turing, which is located in Denver or centered around Denver. Raise your hand if you're a Turing person here. Yeah, all right. So Turing, right, at the time I went to Turing was 2016. There's kind of this proliferation of code schools of pretty wide array of quality. And I would say that Turing is definitely on the end of a very high quality program. And one of the things that's so high quality about it is its mission, which is to bring folks from diverse backgrounds, from non-traditional backgrounds into this profession and into high fulfillment technical careers. So I love my Turing people. I love being a part of this community. And I think Turing has had a huge impact on this Ruby conference and the Ruby community in general. Before I keep going, I also want to thank a few people. So I need to thank the RubyConf planning team for putting this on. Anyone in a red shirt in here who's volunteering, thank you so much. If you see people in red shirts, make sure you thank them. I want to thank Confreaks and the folks who are doing the video and audio. I really appreciate it. And then, of course, I want to thank all of you for coming and using this prime time of RubyConf to do some RSpec with me. So thank you. All right. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of the Gilded Rose kata, or a code. Or let me ask a more general question. Raise your hand if you have heard of a code kata before. OK, cool. And also, I'm supposed to say, don't be afraid of the mics. If you need to, this hopefully will be a little participatory. And if you need to ask a question, please use the mic. So anyway, so the idea of a code kata is it's like an exercise that you do to learn a particular coding principle. And there's a very famous code kata called the Gilded Rose code kata. And it's famous for a couple of reasons. So I guess it has its origin story as like a thing from World of Warcraft. Raise your hand if you've ever played World of Warcraft. OK, so some people know about this game. It came out in 2004. It was very, very popular for a while. I was not addicted to it at any time. And this kata takes some concepts from this part of World of Warcraft, this area in World of Warcraft called Gilded Rose, and it's actually a lot more famous because a very famous person, Sandy Metz, gave a talk a few years ago called All the Little Things. Now, raise your hand if you've seen this talk from, I think, 2014. Yeah. Okay, so everybody, if you are going to leave this talk in the middle, which is okay, the best reason to leave would be to watch this talk, which is on YouTube on Confreaks, or on RailsConf 2014 Confreaks playlist. So what Sandy does in this talk, which is amazing, is she goes through the Gilded Rose kata to teach some really interesting object-oriented design practices. So I thought that it would be interesting to kind of use this code that I thought some folks might have some familiarity with to talk about good testing design and good RSpec specifically. So without belaboring that too much, I want to hopefully get a few things out of this workshop. The first is I want you all to leave with the idea of the purpose and benefits of testing. I want to get really clear on what the object under test is. I want to talk about how testing can be used to document code functionality. I want to make sure everybody understands the three-phase test pattern. And I want us to make sure that in my opinion, we should be writing our tests to optimize for readability. And then the last part, and I think that there were a few talks already today about this, but to use test doubles judiciously, and we'll get into that. Okay. Just a little more disclaimer and prologue to all this. The format of the workshop, so I used to be a teacher for a while, and the format comes from my experience as a teacher. I've never taught in a classroom that looks quite like this, but that's exciting. So the idea with this is I'm going to try to show something, like I'm going to do something up here, demonstrate something. We're going to do something together, and then you'll get a chance to do it on your own. And that's kind of this pattern that we're going to follow through this workshop. Maybe it'll work for you because like the you do portion will be like right at what you need. It'll be at like exactly the right level. But maybe it'll be too easy for you, or maybe it'll be too hard for you, or whatever. In those cases, what I would say is the documentation in the README pretty tightly follows like where I'm going to be going in the workshop. So if you need to speed ahead, you are welcome to. And if we kind of start moving ahead as a group, you have that documentation available to you. So here's where we're going to start doing some audience participation. So I'm going to appreciate the person who's going to be the most brave and join me in talking to this whole group. So my first question is like, why do we test? Like, why should we even be here right now? To validate that our code does what our business told us it should do. Nice.
Catch bugs before they even get to QA.
Yeah, catch bugs before QA in the back. Keep me from breaking my own code. That doesn't work for me, but yeah.
Document our code so new developers coming in can go ahead and run them and see what the app is doing.
Yeah, document the code. So I think that covers a lot of it. And as we go through these exercises, I want to just kind of center on those ideas of why we test. So some folks might have different answers about why we test. And for those folks, this actually might not, the things that I'm prescribing might not be the right solution for them. But if you're on board with kind of what these folks just said, I think hopefully you'll get a lot out of this. I also want to distinguish between two types of tests. There's unit and integration tests. A unit test tests like a specific small portion of business logic, a unit of business logic, typically like a single function or a single class. And an integration test tests sort of the interaction of many things. So a good example would be like, of an integration test would be, if I poke a person and they have a reaction, there's like a lot of systems in the body that are responding to that poke. If I was just testing, the interaction of a chemical moving from one cell to another, maybe that would be more of a unit test. So going back to Sandy, also, and I forgot this disclaimer. So there's like all these people in this conference who have like done amazing things in the Ruby community, and they're like super smart. And I've been to a couple of their talks, and I just want to be, I think the thing that I'm hoping I bring is that, I haven't written any amazing gems. You probably haven't used code that I've written, but I've taken some deep dives into the world of testing, and hopefully I can share that with you. So Sandy gave another talk called The Magic Tricks of Testing. Has anybody seen this talk? Even fewer. Okay, three people, 4 people. Someone saw it a little bit. Okay. This is another amazing talk that I highly, highly recommend and is going to kind of drive some of the conversation we're having. So Sandy talks about, in addition to this idea of like a unit and an integration test, when we're specifically talking about unit tests, there's kind of 2 types of, I guess, units that we would be thinking about. There are 2 types of methods that we might want to test. The first is a query method. And a query method returns something and changes nothing. And the second type is a command method. And a command method returns nothing but changes something. So when we have these 2 types of methods, we're going to test them in different ways. So I'm going to show you a method, and I want you to decide with the person sitting next to you if it is a query method or a command method. Okay, here it is. Okay, talk to the person sitting next to you for like 30 seconds. Query method or command method? Okay, good conversation. Thank you for engaging in that. Who's got an idea? Who wants to share what their partner said or share what your partner discussed? Yeah, go ahead. Query, great. Does anyone want to elaborate on that? Yeah, in the back or in the middle. Yeah, for sure. So definitely been in the situation where something says count, and maybe under the covers it's not just counting, but popping something off or adding something. But yeah, I think that's right. Query, based on what we see, this is most likely a query method. How about this one? Okay, I think, can I call on you in the orange? Okay. Right, so this person just said that it's a command method because it's changing the state, and given the caveat of the previous answer that maybe something weird is happening here, yeah, I think that's right. So the question is, how do you go about testing a query method, and how do you go about testing a command method, right? So what I would say, and this is, I'm stealing this from Sandy, when you have a query method, you want to test the return value, right? You want to say, right, if I want to test that workshop count works the way that I think it should, I'm going to say the return value of workshop count is what I think it should be. If there's 30 people in a workshop, when I call workshop count, I should get 30. In a command method, you're testing the state change, right? So instead of saying enroll returns a certain value, I actually should test the state, the participant state, to figure out if this is working the way it should work. So probably if I enroll 1 participant, the number of participants should go up by 1, and so my test is going to be on that participant's array thing. And so Sandy put together this wonderful diagram to kind of explain that, and what we just talked about is kind of that top row, and then the bottom row is where we're going to get into test doubles in just a little bit. Okay, so we're about to jump into our first workshop activity, and the goal here is to understand this concept of an object under test. And I want to go with kind of my experience here, which is a lot of times I'll be asked to implement some new code or understand why something is doing what it's doing, and I'll open up the test file because they always say, like, tests are great documentation, And if I need to figure out like what is supposed to happen here, I can just go look at the RSpec file, and it should be, it should tell me more or less what's going on. And for me, I've actually never had that experience. Like, it's very rare for me to go into an RSpec file and gain more clarity about what should be happening. Do folks feel like they get a ton of clarity? Or I guess raise your hand if you don't get a ton of clarity when you open an RSpec file typically. Yeah. And at work, we sometimes host folks from Turing to come in, early career developers who are finishing up their journeys at Turing. And the thing that really brought this home for me is I'll take someone who's never seen the code base, and I'll pick a feature that I think this can be solved with one line of code, or maybe just even one word. And it always takes the longest amount of time to explain the spec file to this poor person. And 45 minutes will go by, and I'm like, okay, and in the third context block, you'll see. And I think that hopefully what we'll get from this is that, we can optimize the way that we write tests to make it not actually confusing for ourselves or for our new teammates that we're bringing up to speed. Okay. So I want to show you some code. This is totally valid RSpec. There's a keyword here called subject. Raise your hand if you're familiar with the subject keyword. I'm not going to make you explain it. Okay, a lot of folks are, so we'll go very fast. So RSpec somehow, under the hood, figures out that it will default and give you this subject keyword, which maps to the workshop, matched to the class that you're testing. And so in this case, we're saying, we expect this workshop to be a type of workshop, to be an instance of a workshop. To me, I have a little bit of a problem with this test. And the problem is that there's a mystery guest here. There's a ghost in the room. Basically, unless you have a lot of context about how RSpec works, it can be difficult to understand what this subject is. So if someone is coming from like a Java code base, hasn't used RSpec, or they're brand new to RSpec in general, they're going to see this, and it just requires a little bit more knowledge to understand what's going on. Okay, so how can we improve this? One thing we can do is call out explicitly what subject refers to. Now, these two pieces of code are exactly identical functionally. They're doing exactly the same thing. The difference is that in this example, I'm calling out on that first line, subject is actually a new workshop. This is okay. I think that the better way, subject can also take in an argument, and you can name your subject. I think this is even better because, again, it's making it even more explicit what this test is about. And so when I write RSpec, the first thing I do is put the subject right up front. I give it a name, and then I reference that name in my subsequent tests. And I'm trying to optimize for that situation where someone new to RSpec is coming in and has to interpret this. Okay. So now I'm going to ask you all to do something. We'll see how far we get in this, but if you open up the repo that I asked you to clone, on line 7 of the Gilded Rose spec, there's some poorly written RSpec to demonstrate like how you can call out the subject, how you can call out this object under test. So take a second, take like 2-3 minutes, and see if you can reformat that test. If you've got time, commit, push it up, pull it, and then we can start looking at each other's code. I won't put anyone up here on the spot unless they ask to be. But let's see if we can rewrite that test on line 7, and then maybe we can talk about it in about 3 minutes, I want to say. So let's take 3 minutes. I'm turning my mic off, and if you need me, just raise your hand. Okay. So I forgot to mention this, another possible extension activity for the folks who feel super comfortable with this already is you can actually start doing the Gilded Rose kata if you get distracted. And I heard in the front up here, it seems like I made these bingo boards, and I sort of forgot to say what to do. So if you get bingo, you can kind of wave your hand, and I will congratulate you on getting bingo. And again, if this is if you feel like this is going too slow, just jump in and make yourself a bingo board. Did anybody come up with a way to apply what we did with the workshop example to our Gilded Rose example? Does anybody want to just call it out? Yes, awesome. So basically, instead, the big picture here is get rid of subject here. You can call it out up top and put the name Gilded Rose here and go from there. Is there a question or comment?
Do you ever use described class instead of calling out Gilded Rose, or do you find that more confusing?
I'm actually not familiar with that. What is that?
So I think exactly what that here said, but instead of doing Gilded Rose.new, just do described class.
Oh, describe class, the keyword describe class. I see. Yeah, so I like the describe class keyword a lot because when I start especially when I start a new file, naming is hard, and if I use describe class, then I can change the name of the class and not have to go through all my tests and do like a find command. Okay, so the original answer is take subject from here, move it up here, give it a name like Gilded Rose, curly braces, Gilded Rose.new. So you're saying the subject of this test is a new Gilded Rose, and then replace subject here with Gilded Rose. So when the next person comes in here, they'll see, okay, cool, this is a test about a Gilded Rose and not just some random subject keyword that I need to know the internals of RSpec to be familiar with. Yep.
What are your thoughts on a local variable instead of a let?
No. we'll get to that. Yeah. So okay. So let's talk about describe, context, and it. And I put together. I did like a scientific study of every Ruby developer in the world, and every Ruby code base in the world. And it turns out that basically for every line of Ruby that's written, if you break down the time spent writing it versus reading it, you end up with this exact graph. So the writing it portion is the red portion. It represents about 10% of the time. And the reading it is about 90% of the time. And actually, the longer the code base is around, the more that skews towards reading. So if we are writing code that, for the most part, is read and not written, we should be optimizing our code for the reader and not the writer. Okay, I'm going to say that again. If we're writing code that is mostly read, we should be optimizing for the reader of the code, not the writer of the code. And that can be selfish because often we read our own code. So the sort of next part here is meant to demonstrate one way that you can optimize for the reader when you're doing RSpec. Okay, so we've gotten to the point where we are describing this workshop, and we have this method in RSpec called describe, and I think this is super helpful. You start out by saying, here's the method that this test is going to describe. And does anybody know what the hash convention is there before enroll? Has anybody seen that? I see 2 hands. Does anybody feel comfortable sharing with the group? Yeah, in the back? Yeah. Yeah, so this is a way to like, it doesn't necessarily mean, it doesn't have to be an instance method, but like the connotation there is that enroll is an instance method it's a method that you can call on an instance of a workshop. And the opposite, a class method would be connoted with just a dot. So if I was describing how we go about creating a workshop, I might start this way. And I think this is really nice because it calls out really clearly, this is the method that we're testing. Okay, so this is often what I see in the code that I've worked on in the past. You get, here's this describe method maybe, and then here's what it does, and it just does what it says. And that is not, this is optimization for the writer of the code. It's very easy just to say, I'm just going to type in roles. But coming back in here, this doesn't actually tell me anything as the reader. So I want to advocate really strongly that we take advantage of writing out clear descriptions in our if blocks. So enroll actually adds a participant to a workshop. Okay. Sometimes you'll have examples like this where you'll have one test that says, okay, it adds a participant to the workshop when there's room, and it doesn't add a participant to a workshop when the workshop is full. Okay. RSpec gives us a tool to specifically design for this. So when our app is in a certain state, we can show that with context. So whenever I see the word when in an it statement, I immediately think I should be potentially using a context block. So here, instead of those 2 long it blocks, we have these context blocks called out where when there's room in the workshop, we're going to add a participant, and when the workshop is full, it does not add a participant to the workshop. Does anyone have any, some people have feelings about this. Some people don't like this at all. Some people, I'm curious, do folks have thoughts on this? Exactly. So what the participant just said was that you can get granular control over the variables in each of those blocks. So if we're continuing to go through this workshop example, at the top I can have my subject, my workshop subject, and then within each of these it blocks I'm calling the workshop. But then within each context, maybe I'm doing something to the workshop that's slightly different, and that becomes very apparent in the context block. So I think you're dead on. Okay, let's look at line 11. I'm going to pull this up in GitHub. Okay. So line 11, we have a test for, and you don't have to know what any of this stuff is. In fact, Sandy does her whole Gilded Rose talk like not even knowing at all what the point of the Gilded Rose is. So the point here is not to understand necessarily what a normal item is or what cell date is, but is there a way that we could maybe make this test that starts on line 11 a little bit cleaner with some describe, it, and context blocks? And I'm curious to see where people put, how people break that up, because you can do it in a couple ways. So why don't we take 4 or 5 minutes? Let's take 5 minutes to do that, and then we'll see if folks are brave enough to share. Okay. Hope you had a second to look at this test. Does anyone want to share out what they did to incorporate describe, it, and context into this test on line 11? Okay, how about, okay, great.
I didn't use a describe, but I guess if you wanted to, you can use describe like normal item. But I just did a context, and that was when a normal item has passed its sell date.
Passed.
And then within the context, I moved the gr variable and the gr.pick. So this line is somewhere 14 and 16. And then by it, I changed to lower the normal item quality and then stop exception.
Cool. So again, I'm guessing, I don't know if you have looked closely at the code, but I like that you tried to really explain like what it actually means, what actually happens when someone ticks a Gilded Rose. Like, what does that even mean? Okay, the quality goes down. Cool. That's way more helpful than how it was before. Okay, so now we're going to get to the 3-phase test pattern. So this is kind of common. This isn't just RSpec. This is a lot has been written about this, And the idea is that your test is broken up into 3 parts, 3 phases. The first phase is the arrange phase, where you set up exactly what you need and only what you need. It's a good idea to only set up what you need and not extra stuff, because everything that you set up takes time to set up. And if you set up a ton of stuff that you don't need, your test is going to run slower than it ought to. Okay, so let's go back to this enroll example. I've got a workshop, so I'm setting up a new workshop, and I'm saying it's got 15 seats, just like this one. And we have, I'm setting up a new participant, right? Because I want to test that I can enroll a participant in a workshop and the appropriate side effect happens. And I'm going to set up another participant, Sandy. Maybe Sandy is here. Okay, the point here, though, is that actually, if you came across this test as like an experienced developer, you would look at this and assume, or it would be a totally reasonable assumption to make that you need to have 2 participants in order for enroll to work properly, right? When you're writing when you are doing your setup, anything that you set up, the next reader is going to come in and assume that it's important, that it's there. In this case, we actually to really test enroll, we only need 1 participant. And putting this extra participant in confuses things. It also potentially makes it a little bit slower. Okay, so now let's talk about how we can actually pull this up into let statements. So RSpec has this really nice, I like this. RSpec has this way to declare variables within your example group called let. So I can say let workshop and set this equal to a new workshop with 15 seats. There's also let bang. Is anyone familiar with let bang? A lot of folks. Does anybody want to be brave and share? Someone who hasn't talked yet?
Creates an instance of it, no matter what.
Right. So let is nice because it's lazily loaded. You could put let in a context block or a describe block, and it won't actually run until you call workshop. Let bang will always run. So let bang is actually equivalent to saying before, right? Before all of these tests run, create a workshop with 15 seats. The difference between the reason you would do before versus let bang is with let bang you can add a variable name. You can reference workshop. Here with before, I'm not going to be able to reference that workshop. Say that again? Before is not lazy. So this will happen before if the before will happen in whatever block, depth of block it's in the example group, and it'll run before each example in that example block, not lazily. So before is good, like if you need to. Before is good if you need to set some state that you're not referencing in the test itself. So if I needed to have a workshop in the background that had 15 seats for like my whole conference to run, and I was testing the conference, I might do it this way. Okay, so kind of going back to our example, to run this enroll test, I'm going to have a workshop with 15 seats and 1 participant. I'm going to skip this, actually. I want to do this all together. So the next step, once we've set up the things that we need, is to do the act and assert. So we have 3 phases of test: setup or arrange, act, and then assert. So here's an example of a test that doesn't really follow that arrange, act, assert paradigm. In this case, we have some arrangement, some assertion, right? That first expect is an assert. And then we have some more stuff like an act, and then more assertions. And I see this all the time in the spec files that I open up. There'll be a test that's like 50 lines long or 100 lines long, and it starts with some setup, and then they assert some things, and then there's some more setup, and then they assert some more things. And that, to me, is super confusing, because it's hard to understand, like, what is this test? Like, what's the point of this test? So here, if we're testing that we can enroll folks in the workshop when there is room, then we don't really need that first assertion there. We can just get rid of that. And we can demonstrate how we're going to do that enrolling by calling it, and then we're going to make assertions on the on what comes on the state change that we get from enrolling a participant. So this is, I think, better than what we had before, right? We had this going in crazy order of setup or arrange, assert, action, act, and then assert again. And now we're following that pattern of setup, act, assert. I think that there's actually maybe one more step, which is to get rid of extraneous assertions. So if the first line there, the first expectation fails, right? If the workshop participants.empty actually equals true, then the next one will also fail, and vice versa. So it's like these are duplicative tests. They don't really add a ton of value. So I'm going to just try to keep it simple. And I'm not trying to say that you should only have one assert in every single one of your tests. Some people say that. But I think you should have only meaningful asserts in your tests. Okay, so just to summarize this, we have a three-phase test pattern where we set some stuff up, we act on the thing, and then we make an assertion. And what I'd like everybody to do is, I'm going to throw this up, line 11 of the Gilded Rose spec. See if you can refactor that test to follow those three phases. So set up, act, and then assert. It's not following that right now, and I'll put that up. And we'll take 5 minutes, and we'll see if someone can be brave and share out what they do. So our goal was to follow the three-phase test pattern of setting up, acting, and then asserting. What feedback, or what did you change on this test that I can throw up here? Cool. So that gets rid of sort of an extra assert. Does anyone add any context or describe here? A couple folks. Does anybody want to share what they did? So something like this. Did anybody, so this participant just said context based on cell date, before cell date, after cell date. Did anybody find like a different hinge point to set their context on? Quality. Can you say more about that?
So there's one case where the quality is greater than 0, and then there's a case where the quality is 0.
Oh, I see. Okay, so cell date is, okay, I see. So given a starting quality of something, yeah, got it. Makes perfect sense. Another thing that I was thinking of is we have these like normal items here, and later on we have some aged brie items and some sulfurous items. I don't know what these are, but that would be another kind of facet to switch on. So we could say, right, context, when given a normal item, it does X, Y, and Z on cell date or whatever. Let's go, we've got 2 questions or comments further in the back. Yeah. So the question was, is it recommended to nest context? So we could have a context for cell date, a context for quality, a context for this type, like normal item or aged sulfurous? So my opinion would be no. The reason I would say no is because it becomes a little tricky to, in a longer text file, in a longer spec file, it becomes a little tricky to keep track of what variables are available in each of those kind of like sub-contexts. I think in a shorter file, it makes sense. But for me, I try to just limit it to one context block deep. I think there was another question, yeah. So the question is, what's the difference between doing let bang gilded rows versus just let gilded rows? Is that what you're saying?
No, the difference between using a let bang versus not using let at all.
Oh, I see. So I could do let bang gilded rows, but this is basically, you're saying this is basically the same thing as GR equals gilded rows. Yeah, so that's a good question. I think the advantage is one of readability and style. So if you do it the way that you just described here, it becomes more of like this is kind of what like mini test I think looks like. I think that the let is, I guess, for me what I like about this is it forces me to be intentional about setup, act, assert. And if I have basically a separate space where I'm setting stuff up, that helps me personally. But I think, when you open up like a mini test type a mini test file, it often looks more like this. You don't have that let keyword unless you're using a special version of mini test. Were there other questions or comments? Yeah, in the back? Oh. Say that again? Correct. So if you call it more than, you're saying if you call it more than once, the gentleman in the back said that let is also memoized. So if you call it more than once, it's not going to redo code. It just saves whatever was in the block.
But it's smart about it. Like if we want attention on outer let, that let changes, we'll reevaluate that one.
Right. Yeah, I wish I was an expert on that, but did you have a comment or a question?
Yeah, sure. I guess there are different camps on whether or not you should use let, and I'm not on one side or the other. Some people say you shouldn't use let at all because of the mystery guest thing, and it can be overdone. Other people, well, like use let responsibly. Even if you don't use let, you can use a blank line to separate your arrange, act, and assert. And that works really well too. One of the advantages of that is that it's all together in the context of what you're looking at. So when you're looking at a spec, you can tell what's going on right there. You don't have to start hunting around the file. And then using let allows for you to reuse whatever you're setting up instead of having to copy it over and over again. So you can just use your judgment as you write specs.
Right. So I agree with everything you said. I think the key here is like you want to have everything that you need to understand the test right in front of you. So if my let is for gilded rows is 20 lines up over here, that's going to add to the complexity of reading. And in that case, it would make more sense to just keep it all in that type block. Cool. So we got two more things that I want to talk about. So we're running exactly on time, exactly how I planned it. So we've got two more to do. We'll probably end a little bit early, and then we can really hash out if we should be using let or not, and kind of two people enter, one person leaves kind of situation. So, okay, so the thing I want to talk about next is shared examples. Raise your hand if you have seen this feature in the wild. Some folks, a lot of folks. Okay, cool. Maybe you've seen shared context, perhaps. So similar idea. I'm guessing most of you who are familiar with this will guess where I fall on using shared examples and shared context based on how things have gone so far. But here's basically how it works for those who haven't seen this. You define a shared example by saying, okay, I've got this workshop, and it's going to take in this capacity, and then I'm going to have this typical looking test, but what this gives you is that you can call this test many times with different capacities, right? You can pass in capacity, and suddenly writing your test looks like this. You just say, it behaves like a workshop, and I pass it 15, or it behaves like a workshop, and I pass it 20 for capacity, okay? So this is nice in the sense that if changing the capacity of my workshop is something really important for me to test, I can just have lots of lines like this that kind of do that, and that's easy to copy. But that's an optimization for the writer of the test, right? That makes it faster for me to construct the test, but it's definitely not a optimization for the reader. And when these things fail, the messaging that gets spit out by RSpec I find particularly opaque. And so my recommendation is to never use shared examples or shared context. And I'll caveat that a little bit. So on the one hand, I think that obviously shared examples I think limit impact the readability of your spec file in a negative way. And I think for that alone means that there's basically nobody should be using that. However, maybe you're on a team that documentation is like through the roof. Maybe your team is like the A team of organization. Maybe if you exist on that team where there's like a really deep shared understanding of what these tests are for and what is kind of shared between them, then maybe I can see using them. But really, I don't think there's a ton of reason to use them. Sometimes you might have like a concern where you have like a shared behavior between models in your Rails app, or some shared module that you're including in a class that shares behavior. In those cases, maybe you want to have some shared examples that you can just say like, oh, it behaves like a workshop. But really, I think what are you really gaining from this? I don't think you're gaining a ton of speed in terms of how long it takes to write this, and I think you're losing a lot of readability. So let's kind of refactor this really quick. So instead of saying shared example, workshop capacity, blah, 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 I'm just proposing that we write this like a normal test, and if we need to test multiple capacities, we would have a second test under here that made it clear what was happening. Okay. So now I set up, okay. So in the wild, what I think what this ends up looking like is you have a bunch of it behaves like, and then somewhere in the file you have some shared example that is very tough to sometimes track down. And sometimes these don't even need to be in the same files. So that, I think, also makes it particularly difficult. So what I'd ask folks to try to do for the next 5 minutes is see if you can scratch the itch and get rid of this it behaves like shared context, rewrite the test, and then we'll come back together in about 5 minutes. Okay, so you've come into this Gilded Rose spec file. You found these shared examples. You heard in a workshop at RubyConf that some random guy doesn't like shared examples. What did you do?
I probably went a little too context heavy, but the first thing I did was I broke out a new context based on the fact that the name was different, because before we were testing that the name was, quote, normal. So I created a context that said when the name is non-normal. Being that I didn't look too deeply into the method being tested to know like specifically the underlying function here. And then I broke into 3 separate contexts when I said when the days remaining is positive. And then I had one for when the days remaining is 0, and then for when the days remaining is negative. And then I felt a little stuck, not stuck, because I think, again, I would go context crazy, because I would want to add as many descriptors to break apart those separate behaves like. And I didn't want to have so many contexts that you would get mad and yell at me, so I stopped there.
Steve, you're a very good student. Thank you. I think that makes a ton of sense in general. Like, to me, this is really, I mean, you would never actually do this, and maybe some of you would do this in real life. But I think that breaking it out, being very descriptive, when the days are positive, right? Because otherwise it's like, what is this 5? What is this 10? What is this -1? So I 100% agree there. Cool. All right, we're going to talk about our last topic, which is test doubles. Did anybody go to any of the other testing talks earlier today? Cool. What were your big takeaways about? I think there was one specifically about test doubles, about mocking. Is that right? I missed that one. What would you say the big takeaway was? Okay, I have to watch this talk. This is great. So, so for me, the thing I think about is Justin Searles when it comes to test doubles. So I'm guessing he's not in here. Okay, good. Then I feel better. So Justin runs a company called Test Double, and he gave a talk called Breaking Up with Your Test Suite. Has anybody seen that talk? One person. Okay, cool. Everybody should watch this talk. In it, he describes how he goes about using test doubles. And I'm gonna just kind of try to summarize this point about how to use test doubles judiciously. So he says, the principal value of TDD in this model, and I'll explain what he's talking about there, is discovery. And so he's trying to describe like this method of TDD called top-down or discovery testing. And the idea is that you're doing TDD in this model to discover like how your code should be built, to discover what you need. And he goes on to say, discovery of tiny, boring, consistent units that break big, scary problems down into small, manageable ones is really like the utility of test-driven development. And to do this, he makes heavy use of test doubles, of mocks and stubs. Right? And he gives some great examples where he has this huge, big domain that he can then kind of use test-driven development to break down into smaller components and then solve that big problem. So all that is to say that I agree that if you practice test-driven development where you're doing kind of this top-down, discovery-driven development, I think that is a good use of test doubles. There's times where you should not use test doubles, though. So the key example here is going back to that object under test idea. If you ever see the object under test, the class being described, getting mocked or stubbed or having some behavior kind of asserted upon it, I would say that that's a big red flag. And I actually see this a lot. I see folks saying the thing I'm testing should produce this response or whatever. Actually, let me take a quick step back. Can I get a show of hands? Who's familiar with the idea of a test double? I don't want to go too far down this. Okay. Does anybody want to give like a high level, this is what a test double is before I keep going? A stand-in for the actual object, right? And it comes from the stunt double in Hollywood. That it's a stand-in for the actual actor, and you can basically say, this stand-in should be doing these things. So in this case, in this example, I've got the workshop, and I expect it to receive notify. I expect it to have notify called on it, and then I run my test, and I say workshop.enroll participant, and this would fail if when I enroll a participant, workshop.notify is not subsequently called, and it would pass if when I enroll a participant, workshop.notify is called. So this is a big problem for me. Does anybody want to maybe venture a guess of why this is not a great way to use test doubles? Right, right. It prevents the actual method from being called. So that's a problem. But what if like notify was actually like calling your Twilio API to actually send a text message or something? Yeah. Right. So one thing that you can do, and I guess this gets to like this idea of discovery testing. It's like, if I need to test that when I enroll a participant, this notification is going to happen. This is like, I violated this idea that I'm using the object under test as a test double. And this kind of raises a flag for me that maybe I'm like architecting this not correctly. Maybe I'm designing this incorrectly. Maybe I need something else that I could either use as a mock, that I could use as a mock, as opposed to adding this behavior or stubbing this behavior on the thing that I'm actually testing. So in RSpec, you can do this expect any instance of, and I can say, cool, I've just discovered that I need this other thing, not just my workshop, but I need this other thing. Maybe it's called a messenger. And I expect any instance of messenger to receive notify. And then I call my code, and if there isn't something on the implementation side called a messenger, that is an instance of a messenger, if that instance of messenger doesn't receive notify, this test is going to blow up and going to tell me that when I enroll a participant in my workshop, I'm not getting the expected behavior. So this is one way to do it. Does anyone have any problems with this way of doing it? Say. Yeah. So it is an implementation detail. But what if I think I'm trying to remember who it was, but someone at the very beginning was saying that the reason that we test is to make sure that the business need is being met by the code. And if my product person is like, hey, Jesse, when you enroll someone in the workshop, like they need to get a text message, and if they don't, our business fails, right? So in that case, it isn't just an implementation detail. Yes. Okay. So you're saying that in this case, we're being too prescriptive about, and if I'm not getting this right, so I think that the thing that I would add to that is I'm actually not a huge fan of the expect any instance of. I think it also suggests that there's like a design change that you can make in the code, right? If you find yourself reaching for this any instance, there's a danger there that maybe somewhere else, like randomly, like in a really large code base, there's some other thing down the line, some other instance of messenger that gets called that we call notify on, and we could end up with a kind of a false passing test. That's a problem. So the design challenge, or the design that this could suggest, is like a scary word, like dependency injection. Like, can I somehow give my workshop a messenger, or can I like somehow stub that out? So let's look at another way to do that. So another thing that I can do is say I have a messenger, and I can set it equal to a double, which just means it's like a stunt double. It's a fake thing right now. And when I have my messenger class, at some point in the implementation, I'm going to expect it to receive new. I'm going to expect there to be a new instance of a messenger, and I'm going to expect it to receive that message new with a participant. And we can imagine that like further up, we define the participant and said participant equals participant.new with Jesse. And I'm going to expect that new, that initialization of a messenger returns a messenger. So I'm like kind of overriding that behavior of, that standard behavior of when you initialize a messenger, you get this instance, because I want to say, I want it to actually give me this double at the top. And then I can say that I expect the messenger double to receive that notify method. So I think that this is a lot better than this expect any instance of, because in this case, I could have some, this test could pass accidentally, whereas this could probably would not test accidentally. Another way to do this would be to actually like initialize a messenger here and pass that into our workshop class, but that's another conversation. How do folks feel about the difference between expect any instance of versus like actually using a mock there? See a couple hands in the back. So why don't we go first person who hasn't spoken as much.
I was just giving you the
Oh, you're giving me a thumbs up. Okay, then my friend in the back. So okay, so I think I see what you're saying, but please stop me if this is not what you're saying. I'm still too tied to the implementation of having to new up a messenger here. Is it? And in your opinion, you would prefer to see that a private method is invoked on the workshop? Okay, so would you agree or agree or disagree that we should be testing whether or not the workshop even notifies? So, okay, and maybe we're getting tied down in the individual like imaginary code in both of our heads. But I think I agree with you, because I think that's what I'm trying to do here, where there's something that needs to be notified, right? And whether or not it's a separate messenger class or a notification class or whatever, whether or not that's initialized inside of workshop or passed into workshop, I sort of don't. I mean, that's like kind of besides the point. I guess the goal here is just to say, this is very bad. We don't want to take the object that we're actually testing, workshop, and stub behavior on it. But if there is like a business critical message that we want to assert that is being sent, this is one way to do it. So maybe we can agree to disagree or agree to agree. But no, I appreciate the participation there. Okay, so for the folks all the way in the back who maybe couldn't hear that, you could get some brittleness here. And the brittleness is that if there isn't actually a notify method defined on Messenger, but you're stubbing it, your test might pass, but the code actually might not work. Yeah, absolutely. So that is why we use test doubles judiciously, because they can lead to some brittleness. They can lead to testing implementation detail that you actually don't care about, and they can be too prescriptive. So really, unless there's a very good reason, and we're going to go refer to the talks earlier today to find out what those very good reasons are, I would just say use test doubles judiciously and watch Justin Searle's talk. Cool. So we're a little bit early, but I think that's okay. I want to just say how grateful I am to all of you all for coming to this. I hope it was okay. This is my family. We're located in Denver. You can follow me on Twitter at Planet Efficacy. If anybody wants to talk about the Gilded Rose Kata or Sandy, fan out about Sandy or Justin, or just talk about testing in general, I'll be here for the next 30 minutes or so. And then you can find me probably having a beer. Thank you all so much for doing this with me. I appreciate especially the participation. So thank you.